whole book on Rwanda as well. I'll use it. The nation state is actually a disease. It's a disease. Because the nation state, what is the nation state? There are various ways in which one envisions ideas of a political community. So one kind of political community, if we want to use that phrase, a form of political community that was very common, and a reference was made to the 3 gunpowder empires that Marshall Hodgson had referred to in The Venture of Islam, right? And that's the empire. It's the empire. Now, we don't have to get nostalgic about empires. I'm not nostalgic about empires. But I think it must be understood that empires are far more ecumenical. There's a wonderful book which I'm going to bring to your attention. It's not by a theorist, it's by a person who's a historian. His name is Mark Mazower, and it's a book called Salonika. Okay? So what is this book? It's a book about the city, also known as Thessalonica. It's in the Greek peninsula. So in the early 1940s, this area came under German occupation. The Nazi commander arrived there, and the first thing he said to the local authorities was, "Where is the Jewish ghetto?" And you know why he's asking, of course, because the idea is you round up all the Jews, and eventually, of course, you know that if you look at the way the Holocaust was orchestrated, they were first taken to sub-camps and ghettos, and then they were taken from there to the major camps. All right? Now, on a single street, which is no more than 200 meters long, in Salonika, you would find a mosque, a Greek Orthodox church, a Syrian Orthodox church, a Roman Catholic church, a synagogue, an Anglican church, all in 200 meters. And so when the Jewish commander arrives there, he says, "Where is the Jewish ghetto?" He knows there's a Jewish population, and he was told, "We don't put our Jews in a ghetto." And you know what he does? He writes a memo to the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin and says, I've come to Thessalonica, these people are completely uncivilized. They don't realize that the only place for a Jew is the ghetto. And it's extraordinary. Who's civilized and who's uncivilized here? Okay? Now, that was an empire. It was the Ottoman Empire. Again, I'm not nostalgic. I'm not saying, by the way, that Muslims and non-Muslims were all treated absolutely equally in the empire. No historian worth his or her salt would make that argument. But the point is that there is still a kind of an ecumenism in an empire. The nation state allows no such possibilities. It is an absolute disease. And the fundamental problem, of course, is precisely this, that we are without the imagination of thinking about what other way we can envision something that we might call a political community. Right? So that would be one comment I would make, simply supplementing what has been so eloquently said here, right? To the set of arguments that have already been put before you. I think that will suffice by way of a short comment. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we now open the floor for questions. If anyone has any question, please raise your hand. So we'll take all the questions together.
Hello. Sir, Prathmet at Center for Political Studies. To hear you, sir.
I would like to ask one question. On analyzing contemporary events, I see that there is a prejudice against Muslims in general. People often quote certain historical facts which fuels their privilege.
And similarly, in today's India, I also see a prejudice against Brahmins in general. People also quote certain historical things to demonize Brahmins. So this both is equally wrong. So how should we position ourselves when we are talking about these two issues, the Muslims and the Brahmins? I would like to know your opinion, sir. Thank you very much.
Other?
You know where it's coming from.
Where is the question coming from?
My name is Chole, sir. I am from Sikkim. Sir, sorry I didn't attend the entire of the talk because I was very hungry. I want to have something. Sir, but still I had a question. Sir, regarding the yesterday's episode, the India, and you raised the point about nation state.
Which episode?
The India-Pakistan the match of which happened, and the handshakes. People are belatedly supporting that India should not shake hands. Sir, but when you are rightly critiquing the idea of nation state. Sir, but then how to make people get away from this concept, because now this is so ingrained in us by the state. How do you see people getting away from this concept and seeing and critiquing this concept beyond the spaces of JNU or driving this consciousness in the country at large? Is it possible beyond theoretical framework?
What was the question? What was the question? How do people imagine beyond the nation state? Oh, how it's so ingrained in people's minds.
Sir, my question is related to a saying. There is a saying that says that in common parlance, we find that people usually seem to be saying this, that it is everyone problem, and going by this logic, everyone's problem is nobody's problem. Then how can we imagine a better things, and so that we can solve all the crisis that is underway around the world? Thank you.
We'll take the next set of questions after.
So the first question was a bit of apples and oranges in the Muslim and the Brahmin issue. I don't know how to respond to it, but I can say something about Muslims. There is an anecdote in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, where there are two people going. One has a bike, the other is walking along with him, and one of them says, "It's all the fault of the Jews." And the other one says, "Yes, Jews and bikes." And the person says, "Well, why bikes?" And the person says, "Well, why Jews?" Now the point is that quite often the nation state needs a particular kind of blame game. It needs a particular set of people to have, and unfortunately it happens to be the Muslims right now. Now as far as Islamophobia, the problem, the phenomenon is concerned, it is certainly a phenomenon of the nation state. So let me make a differentiation that I often make. That when it comes to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, very similar forms of hatred, both are forms of hatred that emanate from the nation state. Now what's the difference? The difference is that when it came to the Jews, especially in the mid-19th century and 20th century in Europe, it was the cosmopolitanism of the Jewish identity that became a problem for the nation state, which could not assimilate and accommodate it. And therefore, the problem of the Jews arose from an unassimilable identity existing between nation states. Okay? When it comes to Muslims today, I find the problem of Islamophobia arising from the presence of Muslims within nation states. So I hope I make that distinction clear. The commonality is the nation state. The difference is that when it came to Jewish identity, it was the Jewish in-betweenness of the identity. Whereas when it comes to Muslims, it is the placing within the nations, a problematic placing within. So that's how I respond. I don't know how to respond to the other part of the question, to be honest with you. What are the other questions? I've forgotten. Maybe you can respond and I can think of what the other questions were.
Yeah, so I think that, one question had to do with how to go beyond the nation state. Well, that's obviously a very large question, but I think that the rudiments of beginning of going beyond the nation state is we have to question such things as the idea of loyalty, the idea of patriotism. I think that the things that every nation state recommends to its subjects, I think all of these need to be questioned. We also need to question, by the way, such verities as the idea of schooling in the conventional sense of term. And you go back to Kant in the late 18th century, he's one of the first people to say very candidly that one of the reasons you need schooling is you have to produce obedient subjects of the nation state. So when we talk about the difficulties of a nation state, we also have to talk about the attendant difficulties such as these ideas of obedience. The idea of blindly taking orders and following orders. And by the way, this was, of course, what was absolutely distinct about the Nuremberg trials, because it was the first trial in history where you were being punished for following orders. The attempt was made by the defendants to say, we are just simply following orders. And part of the Nuremberg principles is precisely to say that that cannot exonerate you. In fact, your problem is you followed the orders. You see? Now, all of that is centrally related to the problem of the nation state, if you ask me. But I mean, I would answer it in bits and pieces as to how we need to start thinking about unraveling the idea of the nation state.
But sir, they are also critiquing the idea of democracy, because democracy also came with the nation state and not wrong. And it's, are you critiquing that idea also?
Well, whether the idea of see the fundament, if you're looking at the idea of what is called a liberal democracy, there was a conviction in the West that this idea of a liberal democracy was part of the historical development of the personality and character of the West. Okay, so you go back to theorists like John Locke, people like that, right? There is something about what you might describe as the historical development of this idea and its relationship to a certain kind of society. Now, by the way, I mean, I wouldn't agree with the formulation necessarily. This is a very common formulation, the one that you're invoking, that is that if we're going to dump the nation state, are we not also dumping democracy? Because in fact, English state revolution as cultural revolution goes back to the 10th, 11th century, goes back to the Magna Carta. What is very interesting about England is the way in certain kinds of principles, democratic principles, although there was no democracy, can be seen as far back as the early 11th century. There's a very interesting body of work on this particular question, okay? But do I think that there is a central relationship? Well, if you ask between democracy and the nation state, well, if you look at the theorists, they'll also tell you that one origin is obviously the Greek world. Yes, it was a very different conceptualization because it was really democracy in the polis. And then you have to know exactly what is meant by polis. I mean, Aristotle tells you in politics exactly what it is, right? But I think you would have to agree with me that all of the Western theorists, and certainly, by the way, in the Western popular imagination, this all goes back to ancient Greece. There was no nation state at that time, was there? No, not at all. So there are many different ways in which one can come to this particular question of the relationship of the nation state to a democracy. And certainly my own view of the matter is that there's no intrinsic relationship between the two at all. I mean, the tragedy of the modern times, in a sense, is precisely the fact that those who don't have a nation state, the greatest aspiration is to get one, is to have one. I mean, in that sense, it's not only the Palestinian problem, it's the Kurdish problem, it's the Basque problem. Any number of people who don't have a nation state, what do they want most? They want this beast called a nation state. And then what is a nation state going to do? It becomes a charter for the oppression of all those who cannot be produced as loyal subjects of that nation state. That's the problem, you see? So that would be my response to that. There was some question, about isn't it the case that Brahmins are facing the same prejudice that Muslims are, or Dalits, I mean, really, that stretches the imagination, frankly. I mean, what more can I say? Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that that there may not be some radical Dalit activists who obviously have taken what you can describe as a strongly anti-Brahminical view, but it really beggars the imagination to even suppose that one can compare these two, you know? I mean, this is like white supremacists in America who are now complaining that they're living under, you know, the authority of black women who don't even have the faculty of reasoning. That's what Charlie Kirk has effectively said. And who are the people who are admitted by, you know, if you look at the Trump administration, there's no more refugees, but one group of people was allowed, only one. Only one. That's the Afrikaners. No, and that's the people who are the citadel of orthodoxy and the architects of apartheid. I mean, really, it's a laughable proposition. I'm sorry. The minute we start entertaining such views, we're going to run into some difficulties. You know.
Can I make one point? One point on the question of nation states and democracy. I'll give you examples of 3 nation states and 3 democracies. US, UK, Israel. As far as I understand the situation right now, the US is going down an authoritarian path. So is the UK. They prescribe Palestine action. Now, apparently the only liberal democracy that exists in the Middle East is Israel. Now, in terms of the kind of shameless support that the US and UK are giving to Israel, you see an end of liberal democracy there. Do you get the point I'm making? So in the attempt to salvage, supposedly, the only nation state in the Middle East, these 2 very established liberal democracies are endangering their own liberal democratic possibilities. There you have it. Nation states and liberal democracies.
Thank you so much, professors.
I mean, first of all, I would like to share the hopelessness with which Dr. Amir Ali has spoken, which makes me, first of all, again, apologize for the academic orientation that I'm going to bring in this question. My question, which, of course, the 5 or 6 points that the conjecture that we were talking about, one of the important things that we have missed, partly is the overwhelming source of information that we have. And that information is sourced through or seen as data, which is monetized. So there is a logic of commoditization which drives the information that runs through the world, which also breaks into the notion of nation state and how they are looking at the world. Vis-a-vis the social and political. And that social and political did not develop as adequately as the economic. Even more so during the neoliberal logic of relations, the logic of relations that we find, everything has to be a quid pro quo, commoditized, undergirded by a commoditization. My question is, in such a state of affair as we are right now, where the economic overwhelms the social and the political, how do we then spread the wings of the other 2 vis-a-vis the first? I think Piketty and Sandel are discussing the idea of decommodification, but do you have anything where you can add, where you de-spill the oil of economy, metaphorically speaking, de-spill the oil that has spread, the economic oil, and actually spreading the social and political. So I hope I was clear. Thank you so much.
मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि we are talking about India in the world or the politics of past and uncommon future and our uncommon future. मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि इंडिया इन द वर्ल्ड आज के टाइम पे लॉस्ट हो चुका है और जो अनकॉमन अनसर्टेन अनजस्ट फ्यूचर वी आर ऑब्जर्विंग, इट्स ट्रू, लेकिन ये क्यों है? और अगर ये ड्यू टू राइज ऑफ अथॉरिटेरियन रिजीम्स और आइडियाज है तो इसे हम काउंटर क्यों नहीं कर पा रहे हैं? थोड़े वर्ल्ड वाइड हम पॉपुलेशन को अपील क्यों नहीं कर पा रहे हैं और वो अपील मुकम्मल क्यों नहीं हो पा रहा? और दूसरा क्वेश्चन ये कि हमारे लिए बेस्ट जो आइडिया है वो क्या है और हम किस तरीके से अनकॉमन अनसर्टेन अनजस्ट फ्यूचर को हम कॉमन फ्यूचर कैसे शेप कर सकते हैं, बिल्ड कर सकते हैं, और वो कॉमन फ्यूचर है क्या एक्चुअली, मतलब जो वर्ल्ड वाइड ह्यूमैनिटी के लिए एक कॉमन फ्यूचर है.
Sir, with everything upcoming in South Asia of us being very geographically fragile due to climate change now. Is it that like the politics of identity, politics of recognition has itself the ascendance of these both these politics would always be perverted for the benefit of the majority? And taking a very pessimist look at that, how are we supposed to go over this while also taking into consideration the necessity of these two politics for the minorities? Because what I am seeing, it is the politics of recognition and identity has always been hijacked. Even victimhood, we have new regimes of victimhood coming up all around the world with the majority hijacking it. So with all these three things, while being very necessary for the minorities, have been used as a tool now. So how do we go from these, and while also recognizing the importance of it, but also escaping the majority hijacking it? And I think these three things are contradicting this cosmopolitanism as of now, which you both are saying that we should aspire.
So my question is to Professor. Okay, on.
No, this question about the economic and completely dominant. Someone asked me that question from over here. It's very important to be able to think very, very capaciously in certain times. Now, one problem, someone mentioned, I think, Shari, you mentioned this point, the inability to think beyond the received confines of the nation state. Now, the imperative becomes very significant when the nation state is not able to solve the crisis of the world right now. Can it solve climate crisis? Of course it can't. Artificial intelligence? Of course it can't. Okay, therefore what we have is this requirement to think on a big scale. I often use this term by the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman. Use this term moral ambition. Now I don't see moral ambition among social scientists. Now one aspect of this moral ambition is to not be able to just think of human beings as homo economicus. There is more to human beings than just the rational calculation of advantages and disadvantages. It is important to be able to think about human beings in that sense. That man does not live by bread alone, as the old saying goes. This would be one of the ways, and I know it sounds difficult, but the whole point is that it is in times of the kind that Professor Lal, you began your talk with, which I tried to continue. It is in such times of intensity that one has to really think in these terms, think beyond received confines. And if one is confined and constrained within those confines, then you will have a certain kind of non-solution. So my specific response would be that man does not live by bread alone, that the ability to think of man beyond being mere homo economicus would be one significant way in which this can be brought up. The question of minorities is important because what you have is, and again you mentioned this, the kind of demonization of the migrant that we see in the world right now. Let me just make one point. We have now a category of the climate migrant. Now, as climate change unfolds and we do nothing about it, I'm sure the world will do nothing about it, what we will see is a almost mass biblical level migration towards the temperate zones. No nation state's boundaries will be able to contain those massive biblical flows of people. It reminds me of King Canute, who famously stood on the shore of his realm, and he said, I am so powerful that I will command the waves to go back. Any right-wing politician who bases his politics on migration and believes that the borders can be shut up and completely sealed off just doesn't know what he's talking about. We are in for a particular kind of biblical level migration that the borders of the nation state will just not be able to withstand, and therefore the whole point about thinking capaciously.
All right, I'll be very brief. Two or three comments. The first is simply this, that this is with regard to the question about the economic and the economic subsuming the political and the cultural. Now, I had adverted to actually that gap that is intrinsic to that question. That is that the question assumes that there is this gap between the economic and the political and the cultural. I was using a very different language when I was saying that there is a growing gap between the technological and our moral capacities. Remember that, in the most rudimentary Marxian framework, in the most rudimentary, culture, art, all of that, this is all part of the superstructure, then the economics is the base. in the most rudimentary framework that we've had, right? And of course, one of the fundamental aspects of the emergence of the kind of technology that we have had in the gap is precisely the fact that there is a conjuncture between technology and economics itself. The economic is becoming increasingly technological, the technological is becoming increasingly economics. They have become a kind of a doppelganger, if I may put it this way. Okay? And I don't think it is incidentally an accident that much of this growing inequality is also based fundamentally on the accumulation of wealth by people who are largely part of the technological world. Now, there is a point that my colleague here has made, which I think I want to reinforce, and that's precisely why I was trying to understate that element of the story, which is that part of the idea of modernity that we have inherited and that we are in fact unquestioningly subject to is this idea of homo economicus. The supposition that it is the economic that fundamentally defines the human. I think this is a fundamental problem. It's a moral problem, it's a philosophical problem, it's a sociological problem for society. Right? And that is really the way in which I would like to be able to think through this question. Now, on the question of minority, majority, and you're a political theorist, you may have a different view. I have my own theory on this. I want to submit to you very simply, without getting into the details of looking at the question of majority and minorities in every country and how it plays out. This way of thinking is part of the logic of the nation state. It is a kind of political arithmetic which did not exist before. As somebody might say, yeah, that makes no sense to me. Isn't it the case that the Parsis and the Jews were minorities in India? The question is, did they always think of themselves as minorities? You could be a minority and you could have played a critical role as the Parsis did in the creation of Bombay. You can't even imagine Bombay without what the Parsis did. They were the backbone. And the Jews, the Sassoon family, for example, right? And their numbers are minuscule. If you're looking at the totality of India. When did we start thinking in the language of majority and minority? My simple submission is it's a kind of political arithmetic which has a fundamental relationship to both modernity and the nation state. And so I think the first thing is that we have to actually stop thinking of majority and minorities. We have to invent new languages to think about our social relationships with those who differ from us in some fundamental respect. Right? That is, I think, the direction in which I would want to go when I begin to think of these questions.
We'll take two more questions.
I don't know whether it is relevant to the topic, but sir, you said that in the end, individually we can condemn the wrong and be with the right. So, so when we study about, say, gender-based violence and resistance against it, most of the literature focus on individual resistance. And then we pat our backs that, individually we are resisting. But does it really matter? Can we really pat our backs if it's not culminating into any collective action? So even with this, like, how do we see resistance? Can we just really feel good about individually condemning things? And so what in this era, what we can call protest or resistance, if not collective action?
My question is to Professor Lal, and so when you were highlighting about it, was very interesting to see that how different registers, be it culture, be it writing, be it cinema, be it theatres, were thinking about concerns that were far more big, far more important, but were also crossing the boundaries and confines of nation states. And something that we lack, something that we talk about, what you were proposing about the common or the uncommon futures. So I just wanted to know from you whether what sort of analysis or what is that limited Indian cultural, political, social experiments particularly when we see from 90s onwards, when India is also entering into the global machine of global capitalism, what is that we see a very certain kind of fundamental lack that is existent in terms of why questions outside the confines of our borders are not becoming an eminent issue that that we as a humans should always think about. I always think about poets like Sahib, who would write poetry, who would whenever he would pen songs for his movies, they would always evoke a sense of transnationalism, questions, concerns that are beyond the confines of what you are facing in your immediate political present. So I want to know that what is the lack that is out there that you could kind of touch about, and in what way we can unfold a future from here where these enrichments could be sourced from global examples, and we can move ahead towards creating solidarity networks that are now very much secluded, that are now very much premised on our own indigenous interests. Thank you.
Should we begin?
You can begin.
Okay, so this question, I hope, in fact, I perhaps did convey a slightly methodologically individualist one. That's not the way I want to think about it. I'm just trying to suggest, in the way that I talked about politics and what I call the possibilities of the political, that politics is a quintessentially collective activity. Okay, in that sense, I'm very clear about what politics is. Now, this point about, it's not about individual condemnation. It's not about a mechanical agglomeration or aggregation of individual protests. It is all about a certain position that more and more people need to take. And the reason I say this is because what has concerned me about Indian academia especially is the inability or unwillingness to even speak out against this. And I think that this becomes a kind of a transformative thing. It sounds a little diffuse to say this, but if you really think of the movement and trajectory of history, where does it all begin? It begins through agonized conversations around dining tables, right? Parents talking to their children, children talking back to their parents, in perhaps situations of this particular kind. But I think that somewhere in the larger logic of things, it will not show immediately. But for each of these single little bits of condemnation and commendation that I was talking about, they can go up to add and make something transformative. So it's not in terms of individualizing protest and then agglomerating and aggregate. No, I do not have that in mind. It's a kind of an ethical position that I think more and more people need to take. I've often felt, especially in the environment that we live in, where people are just kind of not willing to speak up. I think that one person speaking up, standing up for the right, will be able to create the possibility of more people. It's like, I don't know who said this, but an act of kindness is contagious. That one act of kindness, who said this? Can you remember who said this?
No, I don't, but...
Yeah, but it's the contagion effect that I think would become transformative in these little bits of standing up and saying, oh, ye galat hai. Okay?
Yeah, I can only, second everything that Professor Amir Ali has said. He's absolutely right that we can think of it this way, that, you can't condition your response with the thought, will it achieve the outcome? Because what makes us ethical, reflective human beings is that if you see something that is unjust, there's something within you that says that I have to rebel against it. Yeah, of course, there are many other aspects to this story. I'm always reminded of this wonderful scene, and I keep coming back. So this also is a way of addressing the question that Himanshu had, because I, for one, am someone who has absolutely no respect for disciplinary boundaries at all. I don't even recognize disciplines as such. And actually, I don't have a single degree in any discipline. I do have degrees, but I don't have a degree in any discipline. My BA and MA were from something called the Humanities Center. My PhD is from South Asian Languages and Civilization. I teach in a history department, and I'm often introduced as a historian. The first thing I say, there is a difference between being a historian and teaching in a history department. The two are not the same. Please, right? So what I'm going to say here also will start touching upon the question that Himanshu is saying, because you notice that I draw upon cinema, I draw upon theater, I draw upon poetry, philosophy, history, whatever the case might be. Now there is this film, one of the majestic works of Hindi cinema. It's called Garam Hava.
Oh, beautiful. It's a beautiful.
Right? It's the best film ever made on the Batwara. I say Batwara because, by the way, in Pakistan, the first thing we must understand here, which we often don't, nobody calls it the partition in Pakistan, my friends. It's Azadi for them. That's what they call it there. They do not call it the partition. Look at the Pakistani historiography on the Batwara. There's a difference, okay? So this film is often encompassed under what is called the Muslim social. I won't get into that, whether it should or shouldn't be, but it's an extraordinary film where Balraj Sahni plays the main character, and at the very end of the film, what happens? Because unhone tala laga diya apne darwaze pe, and he's about to leave town, and then he sits on the tonga, and then he gets down halfway to the station. In fact, he brings the tonga back, and he joins the crowd. The little streams all feed into the ocean, and then the roar of the ocean becomes a force. You have to think of it that way. You can't think that kuch farak padega nahi padega mere bolne se ya na bolne se. Right?
Can you comment on the nature of resistance now? Like it's more now people, so with this, whatever I've read around women's resistance, now more and more focus is on, women, what they, like individual women, what the action they are, maybe when they are angry, they put more salt. That is resistance. But that doesn't bring any change. But so we are now putting a different cloth on resistance, that this is resistance, and we are focusing, or maybe the academia is not focusing on collective action now, it's focusing on individual action more. That is what
but the question, this question will require a lot of discussion, because then there's the question of how does one achieve systemic change in a society? What is the nature of change? Right? And in fact, the first place we begin by, there was a book written by M.N. Srinivas, and this phrase was used by him, social change in modern India. I don't think I've even seen that phrase social change in the last 4 decades, because there is a different discourse, that's the discourse of development, which actually subsumed that, and the two are not the same. The two are very different, because social change was not an ideology, development is an ideology. And so to really properly assess how we're going to tackle the kind of question you are really posing here, we're going to have to speak about things which are going to take a substantial amount of time, because we're going to have to begin to think about what is the nature of the relationship between the individual to the collectivity, to society. How do we understand the very idea of change and social transformation and so on? But Himanshu, going to the question, there you are, the question that you had posed, again, this is really a very large question. I've actually touched upon it in parts already by suggesting that I think the first thing is to liberate ourselves from this idea that I have disciplinary loyalties to this or that. You meet the anthropologists, their disciplinary loyalty is to anthropology, the sociologist to sociology, etc., etc. This is how it works. Okay? But the question here is not only one of thinking about the disciplines and the academic world. Right? One of the reasons I invoked people like Utpal Dutt is not only because he's somebody coming from the theater world. There are different kinds of theater. He takes theater to the people. That's what Nina Sam did. Imagine, there is something extraordinary about showing the films of Fellini and Kurosawa and Ozu to these villagers living in a small village called Hegadu in northwest Karnataka, and the experiment continues to the present day. They have a culture workshop now. It's been cut down to 5 days, and it used to be presided for many years by Anantamurthy himself. He used to go there every year, right? Because I think we have to be able to take some of these ideas to the people as well, right? And here again, and this is where we may have a slight difference, that yes, I think that there is a critique of the academy. I'm the first person to entertain that critique. Unfortunately, the other institutions are even worse than the academy, if you ask me.
True,
I mean, you certainly don't want to be in the banking world if you want to be a human being, okay? An investment banker, hedge fund manager, arms smuggler, you want to be one of those and then still be an ethical human being? I think it's going to be a very tall task, frankly. In the academy, notwithstanding all its limitations, there is still some room for reflexivity, for self-reflexivity. There is still some room. And the onus, of course, is to ensure that the academy doesn't swallow us up, because that is precisely what the disciplines, it's not an accident they're called disciplines. They play a disciplinary role. They subjugate you to the protocols of that discipline and the categories through which that discipline understands the world. You see? Because all disciplines in the social sciences have a vocabulary which is distinctly their own. And I think that we have to question all of that if we are going to begin to really derive what I'm insistently calling a kind of an ethical framework in which we think about the world. That's the brief answer.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to call Himanshu to give the vote of thanks.
Okay, so with this we end this very interesting and stimulating dialogue about past, about the commonalities and non-commonalities and its present iterations, the way in present it is getting unfolded in front of us. My big thanks to Professor Vinay Lal, who took out his time and sort of ensured that he would be here with us and discuss this particular work. Initially, we were working out on some other dates, but to his generosity, he agreed to a later date that we scheduled because Dr. Ali was not available. Amir sir also, who has always been there with us, all through. Whenever we have some idea, we go to him, we discuss, and he always agrees to the fact that at least a dialogue, a public meeting, a discussion with students, with a community of teachers and students coming together and thinking about these issues is an important task. So we always thank Amir sir for this very wonderful, job of coming here and initiating a dialogue. JNU academic people like Daud, JNU Talks, Daud, you have Srijan, Tirtho, Afshin, and all other people who made sure that the arrangements are there, and to the crowd, thank you very much.